Now, I'm pleased to welcome to the stage Brian Wodarski, Partner National Security for Guidehouse, who will introduce our moderator for this last session.
Great, thanks Larry, good afternoon. Guidehouse is a long-standing supporter of INSA and your important work supporting public-private partnerships. At Guidehouse, our national security team delivers innovative, technology-driven solutions to intelligence, national security, and law enforcement organizations. I'm thrilled to have spent the day connecting with so many of you in discussing the critical role of technology and data in advancing the national security mission. It's now my pleasure to introduce the moderator of today's closing Fireside Chat, Making It Work, INSA Executive Vice President, John Doyon. A career National Security Agency officer, he held numerous senior leadership positions at NSA and served in assignments at the White House, CIA, the Pentagon, and overseas. Prior to joining INSA in March 2020, John served as the Chief Data Officer and Director, Office of Data Strategy and Information at NCTC. Please welcome John Doyon.
Thanks for that introduction, Brian, and thank you to everyone who's joining us for the last session of the day. It's been a great day, and I think this is going to be a great conversation to wrap it all up. I'd like to welcome our guest, Nancy Morgan, who's the intelligence community's Chief Data Officer. She's also has another title as the Assistant DNI for Domestic Engagement, Information Sharing, and Data. And Ylli Bajraktari, who's the former Executive Director of the NSCAI, which we've been talking a lot about today. And he's currently the CEO of the Special Competitive Studies Project. So to frame our chat this afternoon, I'll mention again what I said in some opening remarks, and that was that one of the key recommended actions in the NSCAI report was the need to transform national intelligence. So we've heard today, we've been talking about this all day long, we've heard about AI strategies and capabilities and operationalizing AI and what operational successes we've had to date, future technologies, we've spanned the whole gamut of issues. But in some ways, we're still kind of in first gear in this journey, and we're working hard to move quickly to realize the potential of AI. So to close the day, let's look at what the issues are that are really going to make it work, and I can't think of two better people to be talking about this with than Nancy and Ylli. So as a reminder, towards the end of the hour, we'll have some audience Q&A. So if you want to send us some questions on your note cards, the staff will be picking them up. And to start the conversation, what do you see as the biggest challenges or barriers to the integration of big data and AI across government or into the intelligence community's mission set? And let's start with Ylli.
Thank you, John. Thanks to INSA for having me today. Before I get to your question, John, I would like just to quickly give an introduction of what was the purpose of the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. Almost 3 years ago, I think our Congress was really alerted to what they were seeing coming out of Beijing. I think what they were seeing out of Beijing was a signal that China is organized and they're putting resources toward getting ahead in all critical technologies, especially on artificial intelligence. I think China, in their mind, was putting a lot of effort because they saw that through AI they can leapfrog their capabilities and overcome us in some of the critical aspects, and the implications would have been enormous for their economy, society, and ultimately the national security. So that was the first piece, I think, that was on congressional mindset. The second piece was that our Congress believed that we're not organized for this competition. That while we have islands of hope in DNI, CIA, in DoD, we as a country were not organized for this competition. And the ramifications for not being organized for this competition would have been huge for our country. And so they created this AI commission. Like the nature is for these commissions, they picked 15 individuals from private sector, academia, and former government officials to look at the problem set and to come up with recommendation to what can we do more as a country, and specifically our federal agencies, to move faster in adopting these capabilities. I'd like to underscore that my mandate was really clear. We had to look at what can we do with AI for national security purposes. I'd like to underscore that because this was not AI for economy or AI for the society commission. This was a commission for what can our federal agencies, specifically DoD and the IC, do more with AI so we can maintain a global advantage for national security purposes. After 2.5 years of work, and also just to remind you, we didn't wait until the end to produce a final report, which is available online. It's pretty thick, 759 pages. We produced recommendations that I think are bigger than just what we can do for national security, because I'm sure as you guys discussed during the day, there are certain things that we say in our report that we have to fix to put our house in order, regardless if we're talking about AI or quantum or bio. The issue of how we get organized is a key thing, and not just how does the intelligence community get organized for this competition, but how does DoD and the White House gets organized for this competition? How do we invest in people? How do we bring those individuals faster into the government? And how we keep them inside the government, I think is another key thing that I'm sure you guys talked about it all day long. But I think the issue of people is, if we have one critical advantage over China, is the issue of people. We have more talented people in this country. We still bring the best people from around the world in our universities and in our companies to contribute here. And so how do we accelerate that? And then how do we keep those guys inside the government? I think we can talk during the conversation today about some of the recommendations we have in our final report. The third category of recommendations is all around hardware. As much as we talk about AI and big data and all these technologies, they all rely on the issue of the computers, the tools we have to enable these capabilities. And when we started the AI Commission journey 3 years ago, a lot of our commissioners insisted that we cover the semiconductor piece. One would argue, why would you cover semiconductor piece? That issue now really dominates almost every talk about the supply chain issues we face, whether or not we've, in microwaves that we use at home, all the way to the car manufacturing that we have here in America. But the semiconductors really are the key thing to how we have these high-performance computers operate and use the high-end chips, and where do they come from, who has the lead, and how we can double down on these kind of hardware-related issues. And then the last piece is really like the key thing to how United States remained the global innovation hub for decades is that we had the triangle of innovation. We had a really good balance between the public sector, private sector, and academia. And that triangle functioned well for the last couple of decades, whether or not the government was investing in the basic R&D, and then over time the private sector overtook those investments. But how do we create a well-balanced triangle of innovation that we still remain, as some of our commission would say, we outmaneuver and out-innovate China? Because this is not about how you become a fast follower, this is about how you run faster. Because they're going to catch up, they're catching up on some of the technologies. We already are seeing some of the indications in terms of the high-power computers, the large language models. We saw what they did with hypersonics. I think they have a strategy, and they're working on their strategy to stay ahead and get ahead. The one thing that we have on our end is we still have better and more talented people. I think we have to help our federal government really move faster into adopting these technologies. And so I'll stop there, John, and I'm happy to chime in during the Q&A on some of the specific recommendations. But the key thing here is like the technology is happening outside of government. These are like cutting-edge technologies that will have, as I said, implication not just for national security, but for our economy as a whole. The faster we enable and we help our federal government really move into this century by using these tools for national security purposes, and the topic of today is for intelligence purposes, I think we can better equip our intelligence officers. We can better have, indications and warning with the use of these capabilities. And ultimately, I think our country and our allies and partners will be safer with the way we can use these capabilities. But I'll stop here, and I look forward to the questions and answers.
Okay. Well, thank you. Boy, a lot. We can delve into a lot there. But let me turn to you next, Nancy, before we do that, and ask you, what do you see as some of the biggest challenges or barriers to the integration of of big data and AI into the IC? Is it like legal constraints? Is it workforce issues? What are you seeing?
Thanks, John, and thanks to INSA for having me today. And great setup, Ylli. So on the government side, it's a little bit of, so what do we do with all this exquisite data and all this exquisite technology? One of the things for me is our complex legal policy oversight and compliance frameworks. Some of us call that the LPOC regime. You've heard me say that if some of you have heard me speak. Really to help us address one of my key things that keeps me up at night is the conflicting authorities. The opportunity to work across the space. If we're going to collaborate more across the intelligence community, across government agencies, our national security threat landscape is evolving and changing. We're working with more partners than ever before, but those authorities are different. And so how do we navigate some of that? What are the authorities under which we can collect or use that data? What rules do we have once we have that data? What if it's got US persons data, personally identifiable information? All of those things we have to navigate. Automation is both a help and a challenge in this space, and we have to take advantage of both in those spaces. What other international laws govern what we do with the data? We're dealing with more data than ever before, and that is something in our society. We do respect the law. How do we do that? How can technology help? How can you help us, our partners in the room, think more innovatively about that? What happens when we combine data sets? How do the rules change? That's an area that I think is an evolving piece of thinking for us. And if we tag the people, tag the data, tag the machines, that's part of some of that underpinning. And I think this morning someone talked about, it's like that old campaign, reading is fundamental. Data management is really fundamental here. It may not be the cool part of the job, but it's the part that enables us to do it and do it right. And so that's another area where how can automation help us do that in a better way than we've been doing it today. So for me, it's sometimes hard to think about all the potential downstream uses of a data set. So how do I orchestrate up front? How do I set up front for the widest possible use of data, combining data in unexpected ways? That's part of it. That volume and variety of data, thank you to Catherine Marsh, who teed that up really well for me earlier today on the 5 V's of data. But how do we get that authoritative data? How do we know that data, the sourcing of that data? Those of you who've been in this space with us, we've talked about that responsible use of data. How are we ensuring that no one's tampered with the analytic? How do we ensure there's no poison data in here? Some of our adversaries are working on that. And so we have to be responsible about that and understand our data supply chain. Conveniently, it's National Supply Chain Month. Kind of convenient. We need to think about that in terms of our data supply chains. We also are swimming in data. You heard about that from almost every panel today, the volume of data. So how do we navigate that in a more coherent way in terms of what we're doing there? And then keying on the theme from this morning as well, that responsible, legal, and ethical use of data. I won't harp on our principles again, but we're pretty proud of them in the IC. But this is a whole of nation responsibility. We need all of you, all of our partners who are part of helping get our data, helping build our analytics, being part of that ecosystem. We have a shared responsibility in what we do. As I said, that risk of that adversarial AI, the risk of poison data, the risk of people tampering or contaminating our data. And so how do we ensure that our tools and our data are tested, trusted, and accountable? And it's not just the data set and the tools, it's the APIs, it's the training data sets, it's the models, it's that whole landscape and ecosystem. Those are important things for us to understand. That is a collective both challenge and opportunity for everyone in this room.
Great. Hey, let's, a lot to unpack there too, but let's go back, Ylli, to the NSCAI report. And one of the key issues there was that the intelligence community we needed to have an AI-ready intelligence community by 2025. And so you've touched a little bit already, Nancy, on I think the workforce piece slightly, but there's also the technology part of that. So you have both the technology and workforce. How do you juggle these two things? What do you start on first? With the limited resources we have, how do we invest in the right workforce issues and also address the technology piece?
Thanks, John. So a couple of things there. Number one is, as I mentioned earlier, we have to acknowledge that technology is a domain of competition. This is no longer an IT issue. This is no longer a data issue. I think this is a domain of competition. I think Director Burns in his confirmation testimony said that one of his top 4 priorities is, one of them is technology, the other one being China, people, and partnerships. So I think we have to understand that maybe after 9/11, this is going to be the biggest shift in our intelligence community, not just because of so like, as I said, the technical piece, but really we are in technology competition with China. And I think that once we understand that from resources, strategy, and policies perspective, I think that will require a completely different shift in how we do business. Not just in terms of procurement or fixing data here and there, but completely realigning and reorganizing our intelligence community. So that's the first piece. The second piece I would say is that, and Nancy was alluding to this, is we need the digital infrastructure. With many intelligence agencies having different mandates, I think we should not look at this from like individual agencies creating their own clouds, their own data sets and all. I think we have to approach this from a platform perspective. And so then that will then create a completely different opportunities for how information is shared, how data moves around, and what pieces of that data is open source that our intelligence officers can rely on. But I think you have to approach this from a much bigger, much more so like geopolitical perspective, rather than just, my intel agency owns this data set, we're going to control it, we have the IP over it, and therefore we're not going to share with anybody else. I think this will really require some creativity on behalf of all the intelligence agencies. I think the role of DNI here is fundamental. I know there are always some heartburn about push and pull between DNI and other intel agencies, but I think DNI can play a fundamental role here in setting the standards for everybody else. We have argued in our final report that DNI should have CTO, Chief Technology Officer, and that CTO would serve as like, having some responsibilities in terms of setting the standards and norms for the wide intelligence community. But I think we have to look beyond our normal, so like small world of what I control. I come from DoD, and I see similar patterns in DoD in which like the data is not shared. There are stovepipes around, acquisition and procurement and all these things related to technologies. I think this will require us to really move beyond those usual impediments that we have, because it's a different, I think, set of geopolitical challenges we have. You also mentioned, and Nancy mentioned, the issue of people. I think this requires also 3 dimensions of people. Number one is how do you bring the talent faster into the government? In our AI report, we have several ideas. My favorite one that still has not picked up enough steam in Congress is because it requires fundamentally changing some other things, is the National Digital Reserve Corps. We have argued that, like every military service, we can create a civil digital corps where our federal agencies would have access to the best and the brightest in Silicon Valley to join our federal government for 2 weeks a year to help with any given problem set. We met really hundreds of individuals in Silicon Valley in the last 3 years who really wanted to contribute for the mission. They're really attracted to the mission and the mandate of our federal agencies. But as you guys know, our federal agencies make it really difficult for these individuals to join. So that's one. The second thing is they don't want to leave their full-time job. So what kind of other options you can offer them to help us? And I think the Digital Reserve Corps is another option because it will allow our federal agencies access to the high-end talent. We're talking about high-end people, top of the tops, from the companies that can help FEMA, HHS, the IC, depending on the needs we have, and they would be willing to do it. The third piece here that I think it's important for the talent piece is, once we have these talented individuals within our federal agencies, you have to have a career path for them. We don't reward people that come with these kind of skills. We either move them based on the mission needs. There's no clear career path. There are no incentives along the way for these people to climb up the ladder and become leaders in these intelligence agencies. And I know this from DoD because in DoD it's much challenging. So we have to create a career path with people that come with these skills. And these are really top-notch skills. When we look at the data, every year in the United States there are 70,000 people that graduate from computer science schools. Any given time there are about 300,000 jobs available. So the supply-demand issue is really not. When you put AI as a top skill, the numbers are even worse. And so then how do we create, and the IC is notorious for this, spaces and opportunities for people who cannot get clearance right away. But these technologies and these problem sets can be solved on the unclassified space. So how do we create these new spaces where you have people that were, I call it, people can go there with hoodies and people with CAC cards and meet in one place, and they can go after one problem set. And I think we have to think about how do we remove some of the barriers that are there for a reason. I completely understand them. But how do we remove these barriers and create these spaces where people can meet and work around these issues? Because again, as I've noticed in the last 3 years, I'm not a technologist by background, but technology is happening in private sector. And the last piece is really how do you create a new mechanism for a public-private dialogue? You know, for many decades during Cold War, government was the center of innovation. Everything happened inside our labs, everything happened due to the work of DARPA. That's no longer the case. We still have some exquisite technologies that are happening inside the government, but these things are happening outside the government. If we look at the current conflict in Ukraine, most of the stuff you can find, it's online. It's not happening right. Gulf 1 and Gulf 2 wars happen on CNN in real time. The war right now is happening on Twitter and in social media. How can we utilize our private companies for the benefit of your mission? And I think we're seeing some good first signals of how these companies are playing a positive role in this conflict. But going forward, the challenge of China will be completely different. We don't have access in China. Our platforms don't operate in China. It was a completely different scenario in the Russia case. But how do we create a new public-private dialogue where, you know, we don't view each other from these antagonistic positions, but we actually come together, as we call it in my office, Team America. We bring together these actors and we work towards finding solutions because, as I said, the government is no longer the sole actor in this space. So we need new mechanisms and new forums bringing these guys together.
Nancy, I'll ask you as well, following up on some of the things Ylli just said. Where do you see the IC as far as being ready, you know, AI ready by 2025, which I just checked is 3 years from now?
So at the speed of government, this is an area where we've got some work to do, but it's something where we're counting on our partnerships. And that's the interesting thing about my portfolio. Although I'm the CDO, I also have a partnerships portfolio in the domestic space. And that's something that I think we're really counting on. There are a variety of activities, a couple of other parts of ODNI, I see human capital, our S&T colleagues, IARPA, and so on, where we're really pushing the envelope on things like beyond the beltway and outside the skiff. How do we think differently about where and how we do our work? Not everyone wants to live in the scenic, lovely Washington, D.C. area. A lot of us like it, but a lot of people like where they are around the country. So how can we set up more regional spaces and opportunities? And I think you're seeing some of our IC elements take advantage of their campus locations to say, how can we leverage the full range of partners out there? Private sector, NGOs, academia, labs, universities, the whole bit. So whether that's NGA's Moonshot in St. Louis, things growing in Huntsville, and I think you guys have events coming up in Huntsville, and so on around the country, how can we do that? It is not easy with some of our government bureaucratic processes, so we still have to break through and challenge those of how do we do some of the mechanics of what we do. But I do think that is one of the few good things out of COVID is it really pushed us to think differently about where and how we do our work. Much more virtual work, having people in some cases work in different locations and still be part of the teams, coming in and out of collaborative teams, putting together more things like that. I think earlier today you heard about some of those stacks. I'm a big fan of, you know, SecDevOps, SecDev AIOps. We need to figure out those platforms and models that let us do that, but do it in a shared way with all of our partners, not just us, doing it with combinations of foreign liaison partners and different coalitions of partners. That's the kind of thing you're hearing us talk about because of the nature of threats around the world. Who are the partners we need for public health and COVID might be different than the partners for climate change, might be different than the partners for China or Russia, Ukraine. We need to be able more seamlessly work with different coalitions of partners in different ways. That's going to push our thinking and our comfort zone. It's not how I was raised in the IC, so we have to think a little bit differently about how we do that. I think on the other things are a variety of talent initiatives. We are, and I'll talk a little bit in a moment about our public-private talent exchange that we're trying to launch, but one of my passions as CDO is we have got to grow. We talk about our digital acumen. You've been hearing about cybersecurity awareness and cyber defense posture, but what about our data acumen? And so how do we grow people who are the triple threat? who have foundational digital skills, who have data acumen, have cyber awareness. Not everyone needs to do all of those at the expert level, but we sure need a larger foundational understanding. And our technologists and data experts need to be able to speak human and talk to people who don't swim in that world. And our policy experts and our civil liberties and privacy people need to be steeped in what are the considerations as part of some of these technologies. So this is that whole of nation, whole of workforce concept. Yes, we want to recruit the best and brightest and bring them in on different combinations, not just full-time tours, but part-time experiences, expert cadres, and so on. But we also have to talk about our extant workforce. That fierce competition for talent, even more fierce when they need to be cleared. I can't go get enough people fast enough. So what can I do about changing the skill set of the population I have? And I see some partners in the room who've been good partners with us on that. How can we get more robust digital learning platforms? What experiences can we give people? Is that hackathons? Is that datathons? Is that challenges? And working more with that broader range of partners that we've talked about? How to create those opportunity spaces to drive that innovation and grow people's skills? How do I bring more people in the mix? Not just hire the new people, but the extant workforce that we have has really significant domain expertise. So how do I push them out of their comfort zone and get them into some of these team spaces? Our most successful programs have been cross-disciplinary teams. My most successful programs, sometimes the spark of that best idea wasn't from the most obvious person on the team. I'm a really big fan of these combined teams. How do we do that at scale? How do we do that with non-traditional partners? How do we figure out who's got the emerging thoughts? Where are the emerging best ideas for something? How do we bring them in the fold? And I think something you mentioned, Ylli, reduce those barriers to getting them into our environment. So that's where we have to think about different kind of arrangements.
Great. Hey, thinking about different kinds of arrangements, I want to go back to something Ylli said, which was some of the recommendations that came out of the report regarding the intelligence community and the how its approach to S&T, and you mentioned chief technology officer as an idea for a new type of thing. Can you say some more about that and how you see some of these issues being addressed as far as the reorganization needed? And as I read through the report, it's again, it's not just the IC, it's the IC and it's the DoD and it's the government. And you really bring it up to this higher level of, hey, sounding the alarm, we're at this competition with China, we really need a different, way ahead.
No, you're right, John. I mean, when we started the commission 3 years ago, as I mentioned, I think really the ask from Congress was, what can we do differently to be organized? And also, what kind of resources we need for this competition? And I think when you look at the recommendation across 759 pages, the one thing that comes across almost in every chapter is the leadership and the ability for us to get organized for that competition. And as you said, we start from the top. We argue that at the end of the Cold War, at the end of the World War II, we created the National Security Council because we were in competition with the Soviet Union, so we needed to have an interagency coordination body for all our federal agencies, so we created NSC at the White House. At the end of the Cold War, because economy became the predominant theme of globalization, we created the National Economic Council, which was really to push for our economic equities globally and get ourselves organized for that competition. We argue that for this competition, where technology is really at the center, we need to create the Technology Competitiveness Council that is led by the Vice President, and it would have two purposes. Number one is it would get all the offices within the Office of the President organized around this competition. Because this is not just about standards and norms and responsible use of AI. This is about resources, this is about the strategy, this is about what are the critical technologies that we have to stay ahead. As I mentioned in many of my other public events, Beijing has a list of technologies they want to dominate from 25 to 2030. They're pretty open about it. There's a list of 9 technologies that Xi Jinping in almost every public engagement has said that they want to have everything made in China, and they want to dominate these sectors by 2030. We need that kind of a top-down driven process on our end to make sure that we have investments and strategies for the technologies we think will have the most benefit for our economy and our society, and that would enable us, to stay ahead in terms of military capabilities for the rest of this decade. And I think that will only come if we're organized from the top and it's come from the White House. The second piece, as you mentioned, we have recommendations for what DoD should do in terms of this competition, and we have a set of recommendations for how can DoD get organized, what kind of offices they need to create or shut down for this competition. And most of the recommendations were for DoD because the mandate of the AI Commission came from the Armed Services Committee. But because of the a lot of joint mission that DoD and IC have, and because of the interest from the Intelligence Committee on the Hill, we also addressed the IC piece of this, and I think we started with DNI because I think one of the key things, AIM is a great initiative that brings together all the IC community around this important topic, but I think we needed to empower the person who brings together these efforts. And having a director of S&T in DNI, we thought is not sufficient enough for the rest of the community to come together. So that's why we argue that the director of S&T needs to become the CTO for the entire IC, because only in that way he will have enough authority and coordination mechanism to bring all the stakeholders together to decide on these technologies that we have to stay ahead. So internally for DNI and the IC purposes, we need one person in charge of this. And then I think, as you guys know, dealing with the interagency matters. And having the right person at the right level that can call his DoD counterparts, that he can call the Department of Commerce counterparts and coordinate these issues, I think will matter a lot. So that's why we strongly argue for the creation of the CTO inside DNI. So that's the one piece. The last piece I would argue is that the one thing that we really pushed a lot with Congress is that the intelligence community needs to have trial and error period built in the budget cycle, because I think there's a general sense in Congress that once DNI or the IC has these capabilities, they will function overnight. They will not function overnight. We will go through a period of trial and error until we get it right. And I think we need to build it in our budget posture. We need to build it in our risk tolerance, because these are some of the capabilities that we need to test, evaluate. Some of them will work, some of them will not work. But I think the way our federal agencies are built and the oversight we have from Congress does not allow for that space. And I think in all the engagements we had with Congress, we told them that we got to be patient. Number one is, this is not you buy it off the shelf and you put it in the IC and it works overnight. It will not work that way. Building data sets, building algorithms that work, that are not, the data that is not spoiled by our adversary or the validity of data, it will take time. And so we need to take a different approach towards the risk and balance it, because the IC is probably the most risk averse of all the agencies for the rightful reasons. So we have to completely come this from a different angle in terms of how we go towards risk, testing these systems, and ultimately deploying them.
Thanks. Hey, let's pick up on the AIM strategy, because I wanted to ask you about that, Nancy. Of course, different IC agencies and departments have been aligning their work under the AIM strategy, which has been out for a while, and I think it's going to get a refresh this year sometime. Can you talk about the AIM strategy and how some of the initiatives that we've been talking about today are falling under that, and what lies ahead, especially sort of the vision, a singular vision for the IC around AI?
So I think you heard some of this morning from Ryan and others and John Beeler, and you've heard tastes of it. We're actually refreshing a number of strategies in the IC right now. The National Intelligence Strategy rewrite is underway, aligning with the new evolved White House priorities. We're also refreshing our data strategy. So these things are all lining up together as we do this as a really whole of nation responsibility. What are the things we need to do? But I think Ryan touched on some of those, so selfishly I'm going to focus a little bit on the data piece of it and some of the data strategies and the things we need to do. It's really important for us to do more in this space. Things like the foundational data management work and the data services, you're going to see as we refresh our data strategy that some of those themes are still present. We didn't finish everything we set out to do in the existing strategy written by my predecessors about 5 years ago, because some of these are hard problems. And some of these take some time, as you said. The government, we don't maybe move at quite the same speed, so there's still some things we need to work there. But it's all about information sharing and safeguarding for me, and that's an and proposition. It's not do one at the expense of the other. That's not how we roll in the community. It's about improving that data usability and that data accessibility. And what are the things that we need to do there, and how can we do this in partnership with technology so that we have both human and machine-enabled best use of data. That data-savvy workforce that I already mentioned and growing our data acumen, that is still a critical initiative in the CDO realm. And then I think the things we're talking about in this space is really what's the future opportunity, and how can we leverage those partnerships and drive some progress in this space. So we have a lot of strategy artifacts that are evolving. By the way, our ICCO colleagues are also refreshing the IC Information Technology Enterprise, or ISITE strategy. So we're also trying to make sure all of these hang together. So it may have taken a little bit longer for some of these to get on the street. COVID also made it a little bit challenging to get some of these things done. And so now we're in the midst of refreshing all of those strategy artifacts in terms of how we do it. There are also things in my mind of, while we're refreshing the strategies, what are we doing with the valuable data holdings that we have? Are we taking most advantage of the data we already have? Are we applying these advanced technologies to our own data holdings, not just go after grabbing more data? We're swimming in data. We've talked about that earlier. How do we maximize that data? And how do we leverage both our mission and our business data? That, I think, is another undeveloped opportunity in our space. Some of our data holdings, as I said before, that data we collect or produce for one purpose perhaps has multiple other purposes and values. That's definitely true with our business data holdings. And are we combining our business data and our mission data to get that more complete picture? That's another opportunity space for some of you in the audience with us today.
Great. Hey, let's ask some questions related to progress and innovation around AI. And the innovation piece was another theme throughout the study. And of course, much of the progress and innovation comes out of the private sector. And the public-private partnership is key there to, I think, solving these AI issues. So the question is, what, in your view, where do you see us, where we fit with this, the public-private integration or public-private partnership around AI? What does that look like, and what's needed, especially for the government, to become this fast follower that we've been talking about some today, where it's something that the private sector has, we want to come right behind them in their wake and adopt those things and integrate them into our systems.
So if I start here, I don't think it's just being a fast follower. I think it's, in all cases, how do we leverage wherever the innovation comes from? And how do we collaborate to drive those innovation cycles faster? And so I think that is part of it. If we see a good solution out there, regardless of where it came from, how can we quickly incorporate it? I think we heard earlier today about our favorite valley of death analogy. How do we get through that, get around it, and get over it? That is something about thinking about it differently and thinking about working in more collaborative ways. It's a whole spectrum of partnerships. There's not just one single way we partner, and not just one single part of the private sector. Yes, it's industry, but it's also those NGOs. It's those labs, it's universities. It's that full range of partnerships and coalitions. It's international coalitions in ways that probably make us a little bit uncomfortable in the IC in some cases, but where is that innovation coming from? Because we have other adversaries who know no bounds in terms of what they'll do to achieve. So how do we work that in that space? So then another piece for us is something we want to figure out is how do we get more movement and more collaboration between the public and private sector? And Ylli talked about one aspect about having an expert cadre perhaps, but something else we have been talking about is launching a public-private talent exchange, or PPTE for short. Taking us a little bit longer than I'd like to get launched, but welcome to the speed of government, working through some of the authorities issues, working through intellectual property issues. But really our goal here is to launch a series of pilots, and no surprise to all of you in this room, two of the key swim lanes for that pilot phase are in fact data and AI. Because those are two of the areas, or AI and machine learning, that we feel we have the most to gain by collaborating differently in the private sector. So how can we create a way for IC officers to go spend time in the private sector, think a couple months to up to a 2-year tour, although I think the pilot phase will be more like a 6-month phase, and in turn to have partners come in from the private sector so we learn about each other's culture. We bring the best and brightest minds to problems. think about this differently. Now we're going to try it in a pilot phase at a smaller scale because we've got to iron out some process things on both sides. We've got some lawyers to work through on both sides, but there's really a lot of energy and excitement about the possibility. And so planning for the equivalent of almost like we would for an acquisitions, a broad area announcement and then some sort of, I hate to call it industry day because I don't really think it's just limited to industry, but how do we kick this off? Find out what opportunity spaces people would create in the private sector to have an IC officer come live embedded with them in their organization, and in turn, how would we embed a private sector expert into one or more spaces in our world so that we can grow that connective tissue, grow the understanding of what drives our world, bring someone with a different optic firsthand to the problem. There are some things to work out in this, but I think there's a lot of energy and excitement about the art of the possible here.
Great. Hey, we're going to go to some audience.
John, can I add just one thing here?
Please, chime in.
So I think in terms of public-private partnership, I think IC was always head of DoD from my perspective, because I think the In-Q-Tel model was really a pathfinder in what I think DoD tried to pursue with DIU. And I know this because I worked the DIU portfolio for a while. But I think In-Q-Tel, be it in a small scale, really gives the IC that advantage over anybody else in terms of horizon scanning of what's happening among private sector, knowing where the technology is headed, and then trying to see what kind of capabilities are dual purposes so we can use it for intelligence purposes. So I think in that sense, I think the IC was really, really ahead of time by creating In-Q-Tel. I think, if I was the IC, I would just probably increase the collaboration with In-Q-Tel and the resources needed in that space, because now, 20 years ago, I think In-Q-Tel was created 20 years ago, or maybe less than 20 years ago, but I think we faced a completely different landscape when it comes to technology. Now, I think when you look at Silicon Valley and other tech valleys across the United States, there are so many good things happening, from self-driving cars to AI, quantum, synthetic bio. I think really the innovation is happening at a small and large scale. So how do we tap into those technologies and bring them faster for the national security purpose, I think, is by having In-Q-Tel-like models, and I think you guys were ahead of that. I think the second piece that I think, just to double down on what Nancy said, we're facing a competitor, again, guys, that they have a civ-mil fusion. I mean, we're facing a competitor that there are no barriers between their private sector and government. So everything that their tech companies have, government uses, has access, or probably they have people that are sitting in those tech companies. We have to create a different public-private partnership. And I think Nancy alluded to some of the steps that DNI is taking, but I think they need to have any kind of authority to remove those barriers. I mean, we are slowed down by our bureaucratic processes, and we're faced with a competitor that really has no bureaucratic processes or barriers. And so we have to move at different speed when it comes to this tech competition. And I think, anytime we have to engage with Hill or anybody that has oversight, responsibilities over DNI, we have to create a new paradigm in this public-private partnership, because we have a private sector that is really at the cutting edge of all things related to tech. If we cannot tap into those capabilities, our adversary has the same access as we do. So they shouldn't have that access, number one. And I think those are responsibilities that are more with the Treasury and Commerce and other departments in DC. But our federal agencies should have access to those capabilities. And that's why I think we need different authorities when it comes to DNI and the other IC elements in terms of accessing these technologies.
Thank you. I'm just going to say, I'll use the rest of the time for audience questions. So if you have any, it's still time to send some up. And the first one is for you, Ylli. I know that the report had some benchmarks regarding AI by 2025. But this question says, what is your vision for AI in 2042? So 20 years from now, what's your vision for AI?
So I'll tell you the backstory about the 25, because a lot of people say, why AI ready 25? I think, as I mentioned to you, a lot of our commissioners were people from private sector. And they wanted to set clear benchmarks. How do we get there? Because otherwise, Nancy and I and you, John, will have the same conversation in 25. We'll admire the same problems about people, about lack of access to these technologies. So they wanted to see clear milestones that how do we get to 2025? And the key thing, how do we measure success in 25, is we don't talk about this anymore. For how many years we have talked about the issue of inability to bring talented individuals inside the government faster. Nancy and Dana has done a tremendous work in really pushing this forward, but we're still talking about this problem. My hope is that by 2025, we don't talk about this issue, that AI is part of everything we do. I remember having some of the conversations in the Pentagon, and the question that somebody asked Eric Schmidt, who was the chair of the commission, was like, what would you do to enable our warfighters to be faster in today's world? And he said, give them the same Wi-Fi bandwidth access that everybody has at home inside the government. Why can we have different choices when we go home to have bandwidth speed, but we don't have the same capability inside the government? So that is a really minimum requirement we need to fix, because otherwise we will not be able to talk about data and having these AI applications if we don't have the Wi-Fi speed that we have at home. 2042, I hope that we will look back in the 20s, and that because I believe that 2025 and 2030 is going to be the most challenging period for our country because of China. I think that is the China window in which they know that they have a window of opportunity. After 2030, I think they will encounter complications domestically because of their demographic problems. So I think their window of opportunity will be in this 5-year time frame. The project that now I'm leading, a special competitive studies project, is focused on how do we get everything right between now and 2025. So that time frame is less risky for our country. 2042, I hope that we will look back and say, like, United States maintained global advantage on all the critical technologies, that this period really served us to move into the next decade and get to 2042 by investing in the right people and the right technologies that dominate our economy, and they really provided enough prosperity for our citizens and our allies and partners. Because the key thing really that I think we didn't mention much during this panel is we are, for example, ahead of China because of the network of allies and partners we have. I was in Germany last month, and the one thing I mentioned, we are ahead in semiconductors because of the Taiwanese TSMC and the Dutch company called ASML. If we didn't have this network of allies and partners in semiconductors, we would not be ahead of China when it comes to the cutting-edge chip productions. So I hope that in 2042 we will really reflect, and we can say that we made the right investments and we made the right bets, because ultimately the technologies is a matter of bet, and we made the right bet that for the technologies we invested, they provided enough prosperity for our economy, and then ultimately our warfighters and our intelligence officials were able to do their work much faster and better for the decades to come.
Great. Well, this next question picks up on that allies and partners theme, and it's for Nancy. And the question is, it's hard enough to share data effectively among US government agencies. What will it take to share data effectively with partners and allies at different levels of trust? For example, the Five Eyes, NATO, others.
So that's where we find ourselves now. The intelligence threats we're dealing with, we're putting together different coalitions, different countries, different partners, different private sector partners. Also wearing my other hat, our federal, state, local, and tribal partners, different combinations at different times. It is a bit of a challenge right now that we don't have the technical underpinnings, the infrastructure to do it in quite the easy ways, but that's what we're trying to work through and figure out. So it is part of some of those fundamentals that I get back about tag the people, tag the data, tag the machines. That is part of it under the covers that enables it. I think some of the technologies, the breakthroughs we've had in cloud technologies and networks and capacity, but where are the investment dollars for some of those partners? You have partners who want to play, but they don't have the resources or wherewithal, so they're going to have to team with other partners. But that is something that we find in the partnership space. People who may be reticent to team with this partner may be willing through another partner. And so that's something that I think you see through the IC Centers for Academic Excellence, some of our other federal partners. Okay, let's not be so narrow-minded to think the partnership only can be through us and ODNI or us and one of the particular 18 members of the IC. How can we leverage those partnerships? How can we leverage other trade associations, other organizations to help us do that? I think we're all going to have to reset our mental model and map. And who are the providers of those capabilities? Who are the providers of the secure and trusted capabilities? Do the partners have the ability to put in the cyber defense posture that they need? We are all in this together, and we're only as strong as our weakest link. So that is making us think differently about that. And how do we bring those partners along? That's where I see some of the opportunity space. In addition, as much as I like to think the US is the leading edge innovator there, we know there are some other countries with some really smart people doing really great things. I think you heard Catherine Marsh talk about that. So how do we leverage those partners, countries, capabilities and their accesses and so on? And it's different combinations of partners in different domain spaces. So a lot of underpinnings to put in place. I'm not sure I'm as confident that we're moving out as aggressively as we need to in figuring out those underpinnings, but I do think private sector partners are part of enabling that and part of understanding the landscape, the reach, what's possible, what reach do you have. Through the Federal CDO Council, we've also been engaging with other partners. So who was one that I thought was interesting when they brought to the meeting? McCormick Spice. And I was like, this is going to be interesting. Maybe I'll get some great ideas on new recipes or what are the latest flavor profiles around the country. But it turns out, related to things like getting vaccine distribution, McCormick Spice has some really interesting access and reach in certain countries because of the relationships they already have built at a very local level in certain countries. So flip the script. How could you use those to help with vaccine distribution? So that's an example of probably not a typical partner we think of in the IC as someone we should be growing and cultivating that relationship with. Totally changes your thinking. So asking everybody to think about who are your partners, who's your reach, who's doing the innovative things, what's a mechanism they already have in place for one purpose that can now be used for another purpose. That's how we all have to think differently about this.
Okay. The next question is for Ylli, and it's, there are many recommendations in the NSCAI report. Which ones would you prioritize? Which are the most important to tackle first?
Thank you, John. Great question. So one thing I'll tell you is the last NDAA, which is the Pentagon budget, which also I think it has elements of the IC budget, passed already 35 of our recommendations. And so we've managed to move a lot of these into NDAA. Last year we had about 19 recommendations that made it into NDAA. I like to also say that we have inspired a lot of other legislations on the Hill. The CHIPS Act that is now pending that would enable $52 billion investments in semiconductors is some of the things that we have pushed really hard for the last 2 years. Look, I'm biased because there are 16 chapters in our final report. It's a long document. And I believe that we have provided our country with a national technology strategy. As I said at the beginning, if you can replace the AI in our report with quantum or bio or any other emerging tech, I still think we fundamentally have to fix all the problems we outline in our report. We mentioned the people problem, we mentioned the bureaucracy problem, we mentioned the organizational pieces. We have to put our house in order because this is a serious competition. As I said at the beginning, and I don't want to overemphasize this, but we're facing a competitor that has put technology at the center of their progress. They view their economic development, their social development, their military capabilities from one lens, technology lens. They think that through that lens they can get ahead of us. I still think that we have moved past looking at technology as an IT issue, and it's moving and it's creeping slowly into the mainstream, but I still think we're not serious enough. And I think we have to keep this drumbeat because otherwise we will be behind, our federal agencies will be behind, and I think, I'm biased, like 16 chapters do provide really a pathway to how do we stay ahead. I think Congress has moved out on a lot of these recommendations, and I'm grateful for that. I think federal agencies have moved a lot. DNI is moving on some. DoD has moved on others. There are some recommendations that are just beyond the armed services and the intel committees. They require the buy-in from other committees. And those are recommendations that I'm still working on for the next year's budget cycle. I mentioned the National Digital Reserve Corps. That is an idea that I think it's a no-brainer because I think it would allow access to a lot of agencies, to these highly talented people. We also argue for creating the Digital Service Academy, something that Ryan has worked on. But basically, similar to the military academies, we can create a Digital Service Academy where we can create civil servants that come up with skills that we need in our federal government. This academy would graduate about 500 people every year. They would owe 5 years to federal government as a payback to free education. But I think you need multiple pathways to how you bring talented people into the government. Nancy mentioned some. I think the Academy, the Digital Reserve Corps, we need to create new pathways so people can come in and out of government. I think longer days, the days are gone when people enter the federal government and stay there for 20, 30 years. We have to think more differently in this. I think COVID accelerated a lot of things, how people are viewing the workforce, workplace, employment, teleworking. All these things are happening under our watch. When you put automation on top of that, I think things are going to get even more difficult. My favorite story is there's a book that talks about the candle lighters at the beginning of last century in New York City. When electricity was invented, candle lighters stopped existing within 5 years, and then their union died within 7 years. If AI and all these emerging tech are going to have such an implication on our workforce, we have to think about reskilling, people inside the government right now. Digital literacy is one of the things that Nancy mentioned, but also like how these things will really happen by the end of this decade. I think it's going to have profound ramification for our country and our workforce, and we have to move faster and be ready for this.
Great. Well, we're just about out of time, but before we finish, I wanted to ask just if you have any parting comments or thoughts or wisdom to share here at the end of the day where we've been talking about all these issues, and we'll start with you, Nancy.
So I think it's really that sort of those two themes we've been hitting on. It's all about the data, but it's also all about the partnerships to make it real, to really be able to use the exquisite data we're collecting and producing. If we just collect it and pile it up in our cylinders of excellence, we haven't succeeded as an intelligence community or as a government. But we can't do it alone. That shared responsibility that I mentioned, that whole of nation concept, and I think you've heard Ylli talk about that, no kidding, that is really what it's going to take on every front. And it is going to take innovative thinking and shaking us up a little bit on the traditional ways we think about things, trying some things out and in new ways so that we can achieve that intelligence integration and achieve, in my case, it's really all about achieving that decision advantage.
Ylli, any final thoughts?
Yeah, so I think, again, to go back to Nancy's point, we need to approach this with a sense of urgency. I think in the 50s when Soviet Union launched the Sputnik satellite, I think it generated an all-American reaction to that, and I think we got organized, we put the resources, and we stayed ahead, and we beat Soviet Union during the Cold War. I feel like we're entering a phase in which everything we're seeing out of China is not being raised to the level of us getting organized and properly resourced. They launched hypersonic weapons, we all saw that. They're doing amazing work in terms of the large language models. That is a subset, a category of AI. They're investing heavily in quantum computing, high performance computing, bio. I think in totality, they're moving towards achieving their goals. I think on our end, we still haven't realized that this is an existential issue for us to get organized and resourced, because this is a once in a generation challenge. And I think the way we start doing these things now will matter for generations to come, for the 2042, John, question you had. So I think, this is the point I've pushed with Congress a lot, I think with federal agencies. I think these are not the things that can wait for the next budget cycle. There are certain things that DNI has the authority to fix tonight, not wait for the budget cycle, but I think there are certain things that Congress can enable DNI to fix going forward with our intelligence community. So I think these things need to be moved at a faster pace. I think we don't have the luxury of time to admire the problem until 2025 and us meet again and talk about the same issues. I think I'm hoping that these things start moving at a faster pace.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. Everyone, a round of applause for our guests.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Oh, wait.